All right. Welcome everyone to this conversation. This conversation is part of the 10 weeks of art, conversation, and action of Strike MoMA. And just to echo this over here, Strike MoMA, what we've been doing at Strike MoMA is not just about negating MoMA as an institution, but also thinking about what post-MoMA futures look like in the process. And I think this conversation is kind of part of for that. What does our life actually and a community looks like outside of these institutions. And so I think the first thing I want to say is I'm really happy that this conversation is actually happening where it's not mediated by any institution and it's much more movement generated kind of a conversation. And I say this especially now because as we see that institutions are talking about decolonization and abolition, it becomes really important to kind of think about it much more from movement context and see how we can further push the narrative and action around what abolition and decolonization means for our communities against these settler systems. So I'm very excited to be part of this conversation. Some of us over here are, on unceded territory of the Lenni Lenape, who are joining this conversation. I'm in Amritsar, Punjab in India. And Dylan and others, if you want to introduce Stefano where you're talking from, I know Fred and Jasbir are in New York. And then one last thing I would like to say is, we don't need to give a lot of bios for everybody who's gathered over here. But what's amazing about this conversation is that everybody who's part of it is not just a radical thinker in terms of just institution and academia, but is actually part of movement generated theory and action, and has been part of doing the movement for a really long time. And so this makes me very excited because I think this is a conversation that I personally have been waiting for a long time to also think about what does solidarity mean between the different movements around decolonization, abolition, and specifically anti-imperialism as well. Amin, do you want to go over briefly what Strike MoMA is, and then we can jump straight into the conversation?
Yeah. So in essence, I think Strike MoMA is the work and product and thinking of, in fact, a lot of groups in the city and beyond the city of New York and generations of thinking. But in essence, many of us had been involved in kind of the work around the Whitney Museum and have been involved in movements for Black Lives and Black Lives Matter to Occupy Wall Street early on, to solidarity work with Standing Rock and so forth. And I think that we've always gone back and forth between seeing institutions as sites of struggle and working in the city and building capacity, both in negation and affirmation as training in the practice of freedom. But the lessons that we learned from the Whitney Museum are salient to kind of highlight here, because many of us came together around this idea of Warren Kanders sells tear gas, and the tear gas was used in Baltimore, was used in prisons here in the United States, was used in Palestine and Tahrir Square. The same company, same owner, Warren Kanders, who was also on the board of trustees of the Whitney. And at the time, the people inside the staff organized to call for the removal of Warren Kanders and to question where philanthropic money comes to the Whitney. And at that time, we began organizing, and again, it's the work and labor and thinking of a lot of different people and groups. But the direct action that was taken for 9 weeks began with kind of tear gas and tried to end with decolonization as a citywide process, and a process in which the museum as an institution can share control for us to figure out how to move forward. That never led anywhere. So when the situation with MoMA came up around Leon Black and their relationship to Jeffrey Epstein and human trafficking and all of these things, we said it wasn't one board member. It's not just the entire board member. It's the regime of MoMA. So how do we address that? And that's when we put out a collaborative document over 3 months of thinking and working and writing and rewriting about framework and terms for struggle against MoMA. But what we were interested in is not this idea of like MoMA as a museum of modern art is somehow salvageable or we care deeply about it being salvageable. It's actually just thinking about, rather than begin with the analysis that the world's better with a Whitney and with a MoMA than without, What does it mean to think of these sites as not neutral, as part of systems in which we're both resisting from and trying to leave? And that's really how we think of MoMA. And it's telling who's on this call and who's tuning in. All sorts of people, from people that would consider themselves artists in the art world to people who would consider themselves involved in movements, or people that are just generally interested with the topic. And I think that this bringing of our friends together for this kind of conversation is to think deeper about the question of institutions like the museum and like the university in broader frameworks of seeking to get free. So that's kind of the point. And I'll just leave you with something that is rarely talked about, but we're in the midst of 10 weeks of art action and conversation. And this conversation is one of those conversations that are not mediated by the institution, that seeks to clarify and articulate ways forward in a multiplicity of ways in which we can do things, but how we can also relate to these institutions in ways that further our liberation. In thinking about the 10 weeks when they end, which is June 11th, we're also thinking about another process that was laid out, which is enacting the deoccupation across from MoMA is the effort to enact a just transition to a post-MoMA futures in the summer and beyond. And so we imagine convening and continuing this conversation without the permission, without the consent of MoMA, as we move forward in thinking about how we're going to live. And Nit, I'm going to send it back to you around the last 2 or 3 points to finish up.
Sorry, I didn't realize I wasn't. The one last thing I think we would say is, like, most recently, with Strike MoMA, the work that we've been doing is also pointing out the kind of interlocking directorate that exists on the board of MoMA. And then what does that mean for our interconnected struggles? And so for the last 2 weeks, as Israel has been bombing Gaza, what we see is also that one of the board members on the board of MoMA is General Dynamics, who actually builds those bombs. Apart from that, they're also somebody who's part of like military contracts in South America, and also Cisneros, who's also on the board of MoMA. They're part of mining operations in the Dominican Republic, where they're also shooting straight at farmers. And this is somebody who's part of majorly funding the Latin American art world globally. And so once again, I think what we want to just emphasize is that it's not just about like one bad board member, or even in this case, like the interlocking directorate of the board members. Our focus is not on like what these boards do, and we don't think personally that it's just the changing of the board that's going to change, what art looks like for us and what exiting these institutions looks like for us. So for us, I think this conversation is also to reorient to each other in the process, right? And then what do these museums, universities, and other institutions, how can they become spaces of encounter for us? And how can we assemble there and build solidarity and kind of think about the worlds that we want to enact today, and not just negating the shittiness that exists outside. With that, I'm just gonna call out Sandy Grande. So Sandy, could you get us started?
Sure. Thank you, Amin and Natasha, for gathering us, first of all. But I'll begin by introducing myself. Ayanchu Venus Tarde Suti Sandy Grande, coming at you from the lands of the Sakyagan Wangan peoples, otherwise known as Hartford, Connecticut. It's kind of perfunctory in these events to sort of talk about what an honor it is to be here. But it truly, along all of you that are assembled here, it truly is an honor. You've all been my dear intellectual friends in my mind for so long. So it's nice to see you, at least in I guess it's the virtual flesh here. And Amin and Natasha, a shout out to you guys too. I feel like you've been some of my lifelines in these times of in quarantining across this year, and what a struggle it was to kind of not be in the streets, or not being able to kind of join folks in the streets. But your organizing and presence in the streets has really, really gave me hope across this time. And I've really learned from you, and you pushed my thinking in terms of the kinds of connections and solidarities that are possible, or that we even raise up and think about. So I'm very grateful, for the time that we've been able to kind of think together and engage the struggle together. And I really appreciate this sort of call to think about the space of exit, as you guys have articulated, a refusal, which, to quote Roger Simpson, refusal is the revenge of consent. So I think that's a sort of a nice thought to put out there to kind of set the tone in a sense. I'm a professor of political science at the University of Connecticut and political science and Native American studies. So I'm very much located in the university. And I'll, being prompted by one of your questions, I think I'll begin by saying, I don't know that universities are relevant to movements for abolition and decolonization, only in so much as I think they're complicit in undermining those efforts. And so we need to take them seriously in that sense. Having said that, though, that's sort of been the ground upon which I've operated for quite a long time. But I say that with a little bit more hesitation now, maybe than ever, in the wake of the Trump's sort of occupation, because I think it's been a long time, at least in my lifetime, to be confronted in that particular way with sort of the bigger, bolder kind of fascism. And so in that time, I gave a lot of thought to the role of liberalism and liberal institutions and what their function was in what we imagine as a democratic society, which doesn't change the fact that those institutions have been built upon and through the dispossession and enslavement of Indigenous and Black peoples. And so I theorize, I think about them as institutions that are predisposed to replicate those violent relations of domination. But in this time, I think I've thought about if universities and other settler institutions actually became sort of the best iterations of themselves, meaning institutions that actually uphold liberal commitments, free speech, civil rights, human rights, equality, equity across the multiple valences. Is its role then to sort of maybe one and only role to serve as a fetter against fascism? At the same time, as an Indigenous person, I understand liberalism and the democratic project as among the biggest threats to Indigenous peoples' sovereignty, primarily in the way that they've served as handmaidens to capital, handmaidens to the project of making race a nation. I work at a land grant or land grab institution as to use Robert Lee and Tristan Atones. If folks haven't seen the land grab institution, land grab university issue of High Country News, definitely check that out. So being in but not of, to kind of use Stefano and Fred's oft repeated phrase, has pretty much been the mode of Indigenous life since 1492. But I think what we're adding here, what you're asking us to think further about, is not just in, it's not sort of just in and not of, but also the elsewhere and otherwise of these institutions. And in life, in a sense, life beyond any kind of productivist or transactional logic, extractive, accumulative logic. And something I really appreciate about this work, I've come to appreciate, I remember lots of our early conversations. I'm like, well, it's strike MoMA, but it's not really a strike, and it's not really about MoMA. So I'm not sure. But thinking through that document, being on the, I had one opportunity to be on the ground with you guys, and the ways that you're sort of connecting these various actions of withdrawal and refusal that are present in a lot of abolitionist, decolonial, anti-imperial movements, which I think it's absolutely important to understand that this shit is global, and it's nice to see a very global audience out there. connecting that, all of that, to sort of imagining of this otherwise, of a decolonial otherwise. And I think my involvement, we came to sort of know each other through New York Stands and Standing Rock and your work with Decolonize This Place. And that was to some degree the beginning of that crosswalk for me for understanding, was in that sort of moment of Standing Rock and understanding, you mentioned the work around, pushing for the resignation of Warren Kanders from the Whitney. And that as millions came through the manufacturing of all those munitions, the Reich, the tear gas, the pepper spray, the body armor, deployed against freedom fighters from Standing Rock to Ferguson to Bahrain, all the places that you mentioned. And fairly recently, I think he gave a huge gift to Brown University. And we need to all be accountable to that, those of us in universities. And I think, and then I was also recently in a conversation with Melanie Yazzie, one of the co-founders of the Red Nation, on Indigenous peoples and climate justice, in which she painted a really vivid and compelling picture about how one of the greatest threats to climate justice right now are police and other agents of the state-sanctioned violence, because they not only protect pipelines and other extractive technologies, but they enact violence. On the land, they harass, arrest, and kill Indigenous peoples, land and water protectors. I think they killed 9 Indigenous land protectors in the Philippines earlier this year. So as for those that are on this call that work in Indigenous struggle, that are Indigenous peoples, I think the work and the questions that you're posing should kind of animate people to understand that if we don't already, and I think we do, but that when you're protecting land and water, you can't afford to not be involved, to not understand what's happening, in abolition, other abolitionist movements, anti-imperial movements, anti-colonial movements across the globe, whether it's Colombia or Palestine, and also the ways in which our institutions, the university being among them, institutions like MoMA, were designed to be integral to that project. So to continually be involved in this process of reflecting and reckoning about that complicity. And I'll stop there and pass it to who's.
Thank you.
Dylan.
But I just want to reiterate that I'm situated in Southern California on occupied Kauai, Tongva land, and I'm not far from where Riverside Police Department stole the life of Taisha Miller in 1998. I remember her every time I drive by that Shell gas station right off campus. Anti-Black police violence never went away, and it's always been here. And I want to thank you all for the invitation. I specifically thank Sandy for bringing me into dialogue with Amin, Natasha, and others. I'm full transparency. I'm a student and a rank and file supporter of Strike MoMA. I'm aspiring at best to be one of your guerrilla intellectuals and soldiers, so to speak. And I use that language really purposefully and intentionally. I don't mean it as some kind of lighthearted abstraction. I really do mean it that way because in response to your question, well, first of all, fuck MoMA. Fuck MoMA. First of all, that. But the reason I say that is places like this crystallize the violence of abstraction, the violence of aesthetics, the violence of rhetoric, and the violence of conceptual regimes at multiple levels. Okay, I'm talking about museums, universities in particular. So I think that y'all have very quickly and easily pushed me to understand how museums and universities in that continuity of violence, right, of abstraction, aesthetics, rhetoric, and concept, thinking about violence in that way intervenes on some overly simplistic notions of how the violence of the things that Sandy just invoked operate. Gendered colonialism, anti-Blackness, carceral chattel, all the rest of that, right? So I'm not trying to push back against materialist understandings of violence at all. I'm saying we need to enrich how the materiality of violence is understood. And if we can do that, we can clearly understand how it is that places like MoMA are a dense center of gravity for convening and authorizing that violence every fucking where. All right, like every fucking where. Like that is what is so important about MoMA and the work that y'all are doing with MoMA. So we also have to make no mistake that this violence of abstraction and everything else, it's a form of low intensity war. This is not periodic, it's not accidental, it's not somehow a corruption or something that's corollary to the foundations of museums like MoMA in and of themselves. They are already establishments that are not only testimonials and tributes to warfare, but they're actually part of the waging of warfare. It's a warfare that's normalized and vindicated through the sheen of prizes, of expensive suits, of oak tables, of research budgets, of high profile artists and scholars in residence, whatever the hell that means. All you have to do is look at how the city, how so-called philanthropists, how administrators have responded to you all. How have they responded to the strike? They've responded through a militarized response that is premised on a utilization or at least an imitation of state terror. This is the thing. Again, full transparency. I had to have a whole pre-conversation with Sandy Natasha Amin like a month ago, seems like a month ago, because I just had to get my head around what was happening, right? And I still don't think I have. I'm doing my best, y'all. I'm doing my best. But when you all outlined to me what has happened in the city, but by which I'm talking about police intimidation, psyops, like there's like very clear and unapologetic mobilization of psychological warfare against you all, right? Attempted infiltration, disinformation campaigns, targeted criminalization of individual people. This shit they did to you, like that you kind of testified to not long, just days ago. It's clear, these are clearly tactics of state terror. So when we think about what is happening there and we see the police presence, how there's a phalanx of cops and their supporters for that matter, that are lined up in front of MoMA, they're clearly engaged in counterinsurgency, right? They know your names, or they know enough of your names, right, to try to terrorize you. They know your religious upbringing, holy shit, right? And they're weaponizing that knowledge against you. And what they're unapologetically doing is they're actually performing how it is that MoMA is the centralization of corporate white supremacist, colonial anti-Black power and wealth. These are people who run MoMA. These are the old blue bloods and the new multiculturalist white supremacist class that crystallized at the site of the MoMA, from Darren Walker at the Ford Foundation, who I have no love for because of what he did in reaction to the movement to try to close Rikers Island. And by the way, I'm a former Ford fellow. I'm still in that Ford email list, right? But Darren Walker, like he gets no sympathy from me. He's only an enemy to me because of the way he's treated movements and the way he's been so irresponsible and reactionary to movements, especially Strike MoMA. But it's not just Darren Walker; it's also people like the Rockefellers. This is how deep it is at the site of the museum. I'll make one more point relating to the university, because this is where I think we can juxtapose in a productive way what's happening with Strike MoMA, the reaction to Strike MoMA, and what's happening in universities around the world, really, but especially around this particular continent. We also have to simultaneously observe what may well happen in the aftermath of Strike MoMA, because I think it's already anticipated in what's happening at a lot of universities and colleges now. At universities and colleges now, we see peculiar forms of counterinsurgency by way of grandstanding efforts to create public-facing ceremonies of campus police reform and another invigorated round of diversity mandates. Much of this that's happening at colleges and universities is a reaction to the global insurgencies against anti-Black police violence of the last year or so, compounded by the movement that I'm very proud to be part of. I'll put a link up in the chat if people want to join up with it, but the continent-wide Cops Off Campus movement, which is, the purpose of which is to abolish police presence at colleges, universities, and all educational and schooling institutions, including K through 12. So we have to make no mistake that when universities and colleges undertake these rounds of constituting new task forces that they invite all of you all into, right? They invite all the people like us into those task forces, right? Because the point is to create a certain kind of ritual and ceremony that will ultimately re-legitimate police power by way of the task force simply existing, right? Not to mention the rounds of reforms and diversity mandates that are eventually mobilized. All those things are oriented around a vindication of the existence and presence of police power and police themselves. So we have to, again, must make no mistake that these are, this is all another dimension of primary tactics and strategies of counterinsurgency, maybe in a low intensity form, which is to say a form that solicits the most liberal, respectable, domesticated tendencies of people who work in and otherwise inhabit universities and colleges as faculty, students, and staff, not to mention administrators. But it is all part of this continuity, this totality of warfare and counterinsurgency. So that is what I see happening at MoMA. And by the way, the last thing I'll say, I actually think it's important that we understand that the militarized policing reaction against you all, this kind of state terror and state terror adjacent reaction to the strike, is we have to resist framing it as an overreaction. Right, just like I would say the same thing with the way the University of California administration reacted to the Wildcat strike of grad students about a year ago, a little over a year ago at UC Santa Cruz. There's a constant, kind of impulse to frame what the university did in kind of creating a kind of militarized riot control repression of the strike as an overreaction. It's not an overreaction. It's actually a completely appropriate, and I mean that in a morbid way, a completely appropriate reaction to what y'all are doing, to what the Wildcat strikers are doing, because this is war, right? So I can't emphasize that enough. I think we have to understand it that way, and I'm grateful to y'all for bringing me into the conversation, because it's forcing me in the best and most creative and challenging way to expand my own kind of understanding and practice around trying to find places of relative autonomy, radical and revolutionary solidarity, and ultimately liberation within this condition of war. And I think that's where we're at, and I'm with you. I appreciate the space that you're giving me here.
Jasbir.
Hi, everyone. I want to begin by acknowledging that I'm a settler on unceded ancestral Lenape homelands, otherwise known as New York City. And I also want to recognize the significance of these lands for Lenape nations, past and present, and also that I'm aware that New York City has the largest urban indigenous population in the United States. And the land acknowledgement, as we know, is a small gesture towards the decolonization of settler colonialism, towards the land back movement. I also want to offer an image description. I'm a middle-aged, brown-skinned Punjabi woman with brown eyes, long black hair, and a ponytail, wearing a gray short-sleeve t-shirt which says "Born in Flames" in red, and I'm wearing silver hoop earrings. So first of all, I just want to say that it's such a pleasure to be here. I've learned so much from all of you. I do want to take a moment to honor and recognize the kind of collective wisdom gathered here. I've been learning about abolition as an obligation from Dylan since I first met him in graduate school at UC Berkeley in the later 90s. And more recently, I was listening to a podcast interview where Dylan calls for a kind of radical optimism. And I think we just heard that from him, which was about not being naive, but also what he said, which is we have to keep pushing forward on the horizons of what we can imagine we can do politically and practically every single fucking day, as per Dylan. I've also really appreciated your fierce leadership at the American Studies Association this past year. Thank you. Sandy, your work on decolonial theory and red pedagogy has been formative for me. It's one of the texts that I always teach in our required feminist knowledge production seminar. It so beautifully opens up the question of what is education and where is it and what and how does it happen and how does it happen beyond and outside of institutions. And then I met Fred and Stefano at the Beyond Biopolitics conference at the CUNY Grad Center. I think it was 2006. I might be wrong about that. It was quite a conference. And I think I heard the very early parts of the undercomments that the two of you presented at that conference, and the thinking on Black fugitivity. And then finally meeting Natasha and Amin in 2014 has just been one of the best things that's ever happened to me. I was on a panel with Amin on a discussion, a forward discussion on Gaza at Temporary Agency, which is a gallery and event space in Brooklyn. And I was putting together some notes this morning, and I realized that so much of what I now understand about the how of political action outside of liberal frames. I really learned from being in struggle with the two of you and with Decolonize This Place. And Amin, I don't know if you remember this, but we wound up on this panel together because Rashid Khalidi had to cancel. And he recommended you in his stead, which I find very, very funny now for many reasons. I have, this is kind of hard because I want to respond so much to, some of the brilliance coming from Sandy and Dylan. And so I'm going to try to make a few points about Strike MoMA and then try to return a little bit to what you each, a few things that what you each said. But I'm hoping here to kind of address what Dylan was saying about enriching how the materiality of that violence is understood. So I'm thinking about, what is Strike MoMA doing? What is it doing both conceptually and in praxis, which are obviously not mutually exclusive from each other. So first of all, I think Strike MoMA is shifting the terms of this conversation in several ways, from who is represented in the museum. So the artists, the curators, the art, the artifacts, and the relationship of the gaze, who's looking at what, to who's doing the work, from administrative work, service work, custodial staff, docents, security, and who is profiteering and how from that work. So in other words, there's a shift here around what the museum is from a kind of politics of consumption of the gaze to the questions of relations and labor and capitalist exploitation that structure the museum and museums in general. And second, I think a really important kind of addition to what's been happening around the question of decolonization and art museums is that there's the conversation about colonial theft of cultures in the quote unquote past. That Strike MoMA is kind of adding to this by saying, this settler museums are not just built from colonial violence in the past, but actually thrive on violence of the present, and also thrive on the anticipated violence of our futures, right? And in this sense, the theft is not over, and there's a projection of the violence of the future. And this anticipatory violence is really important, and I'll come back to that in a moment in terms of the kind of temporal expansion that we're talking about, but also this kind of materiality of the violence that we need to understand. So I think of I am starting to understand both universities and museums as what I would call necropolitically adjacent. They're not necessarily, particularly museums. Universities are, of course, technically state apparatuses, even though we forget this. But museums are not necessarily perceived as state apparatuses, but they absolutely are. They have liberal cover. Art is understood as expressions of cultural resistance. But the necropolitically adjacent is this kind of way of keeping necropolitics at bay in order not to have to challenge necropolitics, in order to not have to take on dismantling them. And so this is not the same as having to challenge necropolitics because they are at bay. It's a deliberate relation to the necropolitical. It's not a byproduct of some misfired benevolence that simply has to be autocorrected. And so this is the reason why the bad apples thesis doesn't make sense. It doesn't work. It's not about shifting the actors and changing out the trustees and the directors. When we say necropolitically adjacent, we mean necropolitically adjacent to police and prisons. So when we're talking about abolition and decolonization in terms of police and prisons, we're also talking about museums and universities as well. The museum is a public good, or it's supposed to be a public good insofar as it generates cultural capital for cities and liberal subjects, and it interpolate publics, but it sanctions some violence towards dispossessed peoples for this greater good. And therefore, there's a deliberate shrinking of the publics that benefit from this public good of the museum, right? This temporal formulation of harm, this anticipatory violence, the violence of the past that museums have attempted to correct via diversity, via reparations around theft, And again, this reshuffling of actors. I'm thinking about injury as a form of future violence, a form of injury and maiming as understood as a kind of future of violence that's being propagated and expanded. So the case of Warren Kanders is really interesting. He's a problem, not just because he owns a weapons manufacturing company, but because of his liberal beliefs in maiming as less violent and less destructive than killing, right? And so what he is part of is the massive expansion of the non-lethal weapons industry. And you can read about this exponential growth that's happened in the last decade globally in Paul Rocher's work, that's R-O-C-H-E-R. So this is this kind of drive for the non-lethality is driven in a sense, it's in the name of liberalism and humanitarianism, this belief that injuring is not as harmful as killing. And I think there's this way in which then museums are authorizing the expansion of violence and also the expansion of its acceptance, right? And so in this way, I think we can think of MoMA as a form of community policing. It's a mode of growing violence. You know, the community in community policing, community relations and recognition are instrumentalized to perpetuate greater violence towards communities, right? Especially a parent. So this kind of, you know, if we could think of MoMA as a form of community policing, it's especially apparent in, for example, the case of the Theater of Operations exhibition. So MoMA PS1 exhibition on the Gulf Wars. Iraqi-American artist Michael Rakowitz, who I believe is here. You know, there was a protest of the artists in this show because Leon Black, who is the chairman of MoMA at that time, also was involved in this private military contractor, formerly known as Blackwater, right? So this kind of imbrication functions in essence as an extension of the war on terror, right? We should keep, again, the war on terror in mind, that it's ongoing and that this is part of how the war on terror continues. So in that sense, it's not hyperbolic to state, as is stated in the Strike MoMA letter, that quote, "There's no denying that Palestine is one of the crime scenes of MoMA's backyard," right? For all of the reasons that have already been laid out in terms of the implication, how imbricated the board of directors of MoMA are with these economies of militarization and maiming in relation to the war on terror, in relation to what's happening in Palestine, in relation to multiple places around the world. What Strike MoMA is also doing is helping us think differently about how and where we do our organizing. So museums in particular are training grounds. They're different from the streets. The police aren't always involved. There's a way of using the stature of the museum against itself, the kind of public space of the museum. And a reminder again that Strike MoMA is the result of more than a decade of organizing at museums, right? The Guggenheim, the American Museum of Natural History, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Brooklyn Museum of Art, and most recently, the Whitney. These are all sites that exemplify the contradictions of capitalism and the manipulation of the public good for private gain. And I wanted to quote something that Amin, I think Amin, you said this in a panel and a different conversation we were having, but what Amin said was, quote, "What we did with the museums is getting to know the city by mapping sites of injustice, moving away from isms, trying to understand the complexity of how capitalism and labor and conflicting positions are held, and building solidarity through knowing that there's tangible loss with an institution that are also just a reflection of society. And this tangible loss within an institution is really important because it speaks to all of the kind of contradictory positionalities of people located in relation to these institutions. Working against the museum does two things. One is obviously to build a base. More importantly, museums are ideal spaces to train. Unlike the streets, museums create a buffer between the protesters and the police, although as we've been talking, not always, and increasingly less so. Once you go out on the street, it's a whole different ballgame. Variations of precarity, risk, vulnerability, and access are exponentially amplified. The protection of the public stature of the museum is useful in order to build a solid footing. So the last thing about what I think Strike MoMA is doing, and this has been already kind of pointed to, is that there's a kind of post-MoMA abolitionist imaginary at work here, holding open the creative demands of abolition. You know, what does it mean to say we do not need profit from war, from economies of maiming and death, from labor exploitation, land grabs, settler colonialism, and the prison industrial complex? We do not need these profits in order to have sustainable, nourishing, representative, and accessible artistic work that are grounded in community needs and desires. And just one last thing I wanted to say about, you know, Sandy, you said something about it's kind of hard not to be in the streets. I wanted to flag that there's a kind of conversation with disability justice that I think that we're trying to figure out a kind of deeper connection to, because this question of life beyond and a kind of extractive, cumulative capitalist logic is really being addressed by disability justice organizers, especially in relation to the way in which abolition and decolonization are taken up jointly. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then the second thing is just these forms of counterinsurgency, absolutely, right, at the university. And another form of this kind of counterinsurgency is how many universities have been hiring law firms that are union busting law firms in order to discipline faculty that are figuring out how to organize. And this has been a big thing that's going on at Rutgers University, which I can also talk about more later. And I will pass that on to, I think, Stefano, you're next.
Thanks. Good evening, everyone. I'm talking to you from London tonight. I'd like to thank Amin and Natasha. It's been a while since I've seen you, but of course I've kept up with what you've been doing, and it's really a thrill to be with you. Here's my strategy. I'm going to say as little as possible so that I can hear more from Jasbir and Dylan and Sandy tonight. And of course, you guys are a really hard act to follow. I'd probably just say just a couple of things which we know, but given that we are all of us somewhat focused on what kind of autonomous movements we can build. I lived for about 10 years in New York, and it was my impression that the vast majority of people in New York are already striking MoMA, and they're striking the Whitney, and they're striking the New York Times, and they're striking NYU, and they're striking Columbia, which, when you think about what Jasbir was hinting at, given that these sites are probably best understood as precincts, you can sort of imagine why most people stay away from them. But they're not just staying away from them. They're not just striking the New York Times. They're not just striking MoMA, as indeed Amin and Natasha have repeatedly insisted, neither are we, you know. They're not just striking him, but they're involved. And here, you know, this is a conversation between me and Fred. So Fred, excuse me if I say things that you were getting ready to say, but that's how it goes, right? You know, most people in New York City have aesthetic lives, and they don't need the fucking MoMA for it, and they never have. And most of them study. They have lives that we could be described as, you know, involvements in forms of education, and they don't need to come to Columbia for that. The main difference between what they do and what we do is that what we do is so impoverished. What we do is so underprivileged. This is the only area in which we are underprivileged, of course. But in the area of actually trying to lead an aesthetic life, or study, you know, we are the underprivileged. We who are at Columbia, we who are at NYU, we who are exhibited at MoMA or who curate at the Whitney. We are the ones who need help. We're the ones who need to find the strike that's already going on. The general strike that Amin and Natasha also spoke to us about in some notes that they sent us earlier. We need them a hell of a lot more than they need us. And they, of course, are reluctant in most instances for us to come to them because we come with the marks of these precincts. You know, where'd you come from? You know, the downtown precinct, you know, can I hang out with you? I don't think so, you know? So we have all kinds of work to do to catch up with the ongoing general strike against these precincts. And of course, you can accuse me of hyperbole for calling them precincts. You know, I mean, NYU doesn't have a bloody basement as far as I know. You know, it doesn't have cops on the take. But MoMA, these universities, these other museums, they were deeply involved in the kind of community policing that Jasbir was just speaking about. You know, they make it their business to go out there and find the people who are trying to live autonomous, collective aesthetic lives, who are trying to live autonomous study lives, who are trying just to keep away from these fuckers, right? But that's not going to happen because what makes these precincts is they send out patrol cars, right? In the form of curators, you know, in the form of community outreach, you know. They won't leave these people alone. And all these people want to do is be left alone. And we try everything with them, right? We try, strike the MoMA, we try participate in the city elections, everything we can think of, right? To track them down and to keep them from continuing their autonomous practices and to try to break their strike. So for me, and then really, I want to hear from all you more than I want to hear from me. The question is, how do we avoid participating in the breaking of the general strike? How do we avoid participating in the breaking of the general strike, which is ongoing against these institutions? So I don't know, but that's the question on my mind, thanks to your contributions. And I'll turn it over to Fred.
Thanks, Stefano.
Hey, everybody. I don't know why you made me go last, but whatever. Usually I say when I'm doing stuff with Stefano that my tongue is in my friend's mouth. You know, echoing Zora Neale Hurston, and in this case, my tongue is especially promiscuous tonight because it's in everybody's mouth. I really don't have much to add. I'll try to pick up a little bit off of what Stefano just said. That maybe, you know, we can even have some practical suggestions about how to avoid breaking the strike. You know, which is to say, you know, how to avoid breaking the strike, how to join the ongoing strike of these, you know, these sort of brutal institutions of our, of the modernity that has been imposed upon us. I guess everybody has said where they are. I kind of feel like I'm nowhere. And in that same time, I'm speaking from somewhere everywhere. Some of everywhere is some Black Southeastern Arkansas vernacular. But I think it's a very precise term, actually. What it is to be nowhere and what it is to be from somewhere everywhere is to acknowledge, you know, how it is that the dislocation and dispossession that has been imposed upon most of the people in the world, you know, can at a certain point become our diasporic choice, if we choose to work it right, and if we choose to make it right. And so, speaking, you know, to you from nowhere and from some of everywhere, and in the general resistance and the general refusal of the theft that manifests itself as property, and the theft that imposes upon itself upon us as territory. That's where I guess I would like to be coming from today. And in that place, or from that place, really the real question is just, you know, how can we get our shit together? And I feel like, you know, this is a question that I've been, you know, that we've been really thinking hard about, that I've been able, you know, been very lucky to be able to try to think through, you know, with Amin and Natasha for a few years now. And we've had so many great discussions, and pushed and challenged each other, you know, from any kind of, away from any kind of, you know, away from any kind of, you know, tendency to want to settle on a point, okay, which is maybe the worst kind of settling you can do, you know, and I've learned from them that my general tendency, which is, so that when I say fuck MoMA, I really mean fuck MoMA. Like I'm not going to MoMA. Like I ain't thinking about MoMA. Like I don't care about MoMA. I don't care what they do. You know, I'm not going to comport myself against MoMA in any way. I'm not asking no questions about MoMA. I'm not asking anything from MoMA. All I really want from MoMA is if they would just please manage to figure out a way to leave me alone. But you know, that tendency is maybe a luxury, that everybody in our position can't quite accept. It's interesting, right? Because the implications of what Stefano was saying is that, you know, and I found this to be the case, particularly with regard to what it means to express or to try and enact solidarity with the Palestinian people, particularly, that what it becomes is a kind of rallying cry or a condition that allows us maybe to see if we can figure out how to organize ourselves a little bit better. Like that's how it usually works. That's how the benefit actually will have accrued, right? Because folks in Gaza know how to fight, and they know how to live, which is why they're getting killed all the time. Okay, and sometimes I think, you know, maybe specifically those of us who have a kind of comportment towards the university, or kind of a comportment towards the museum, they know stuff that we don't know. We have to figure this out. Okay. And it might actually be the case, even though I don't want this to be true, that the way we can begin to figure out how to get our shit together at least requires some initial comportment against the institutions that we're embedded in. But that initial comportment against the institution can only be momentary. Okay, we can't sustain ourselves on being against these motherfuckers all the time. Okay, we can't live like that. We can't do anything like that. We can't be of any use to ourselves or to anybody else like that, right? What that initial moment has to lead to, all but immediately, is some real serious questions about how it is that we comport ourselves in relation to ourselves in these institutions, all the way through these institutions. Okay, how do we actually practice the interplay of abolition and exodus, right? How we become the depth charges, right, that we were sent to the university to be. Okay, so I didn't go to the university. I got sent to the university by the folks in my neighborhood, by by my mom, by, you know, and it was sent with a kind of mission. So, you know, and sometimes it's easy to lose that mission. And I think the easiest way to lose that mission is not because you're venal, not because you're an asshole, not because you're sort of morally impure in the ways that we usually seem to mean when we accuse someone else of complicity. It's not about this or that person being bad or shitty or anything, right? The way that we lose that mission is that we allow the university to extract our fucking attention, right? That's the thing. MoMA is a massive machine for the extraction of aesthetic attention, right? If what Stefano is saying is true, and I believe that it is, that there is all this aesthetic sociality going on in the city of New York all the time, right? Then what MoMA does is it operates on a double level. It extracts the aesthetic attention that folks pay to one another or share with one another, right? And it also extracts aesthetic resources. Okay. I mean, it's so goddamn clear now, if you think about it with regard to Black artists. I remember the Whitney had a show called Black Male, maybe 20 years ago. Famous show. And one of the first pieces in Black Male, I forget the artist who did it. One of the first pieces, you would walk into the gallery. This was the old Whitney up on, you know, 79th Street and Park, Madison, whatever it was. And the first installation in the show when you walked in was this sort of famous piece that had mannequins, okay, Black mannequins dressed as, you know, as security guards, right? Like the security people who you see guarding the exhibits at museums. And of course, it was a perfectly clear and emphatic, you know, sort of assertion of this very real fact that in a lot of ways, the museums like the Whitney and like MoMA were engaged in a practice of excluding Black folks. That the place for being in the museum, if you were Black, was a security guard, certainly not an artist, right? Certainly not represented in the work of artists there, right? So, and it was a very, very important piece. But we live in a different historical moment now, okay? Because the exclusionary structures of the institutions that we all fought against 20 years ago, now what we're fighting against is their constant extractive, right, incorporative modalities. Okay? It's not that they are no longer exclusionary, it's that their modes, their practices of exclusion are extraction and incorporation. Okay? And even that's not new, but it's an update of new technologies, right? An update of old technologies. So part of what's at stake is that sometimes when we fight against the institution and when we try to understand and know something about how the institution operates, we're still fighting against its old models of exclusion, right? Even though it now operates by way of new models of extraction and incorporation. Okay. And we're trying to get into some shit that we should be trying to get the fuck up out of, right? Okay. Now, one way it seems to me that we can begin to work through this problem is to really tend as carefully as we can to how we deal with one another. I don't even like to use the phrase one another because that implies a kind of additive, individuated metaphysics that we want to not believe in, okay? But it's just shorthand, right? But I'm kind of interested in the fact that, at least with regard to the university, maybe this is not true of the museum, we'll have to see. But at least with regard to the university, we still operate within this weird ass condition in which when I'm in a classroom with my students, and we'll be back in that condition in person in the fall, you know, but even on Zoom, when I was in the classroom with my students, the police were never coming to mess with me in my classroom. Okay. Now, that could just be because the institution turns out to really be the benevolent liberal institution that we think it is. On the other hand, it could be the case that the reason that they never sent the police into the classroom was because they knew that somehow I had incorporated the status and the project of the police into my own pedagogical, activities. When we say we want cops off campus, we can't say that without acknowledging that the vast majority of policing that's done on the campus is done by faculty, right? In the classroom, okay? And so what I guess I'm trying to say is maybe what we need to do is to begin to consider, how we can reconfigure our relations internally. Okay? So for me, the strike MoMA is important because, as Stefano says, it allows us to begin to join the ongoing strike that has already been existing against MoMA. And in joining that already existing strike against MoMA, maybe it will allow us to relearn to what our friend Manolo Callahan calls to relearn and to renew our habits of assembly. And I don't mean to just make that an abstract call. We still got time, and we're going to do a whole nother go round. So maybe we can make some practical, talk in a practical way about how to begin doing that, right? What will be when we're going to go back to school now, right? We're going to go back to some of our own collaborative and collective aesthetic practices now, now that the pandemic is lessening in some way, at least in this country. So if that's true, we need to start planning right now for how we're going to go back and do some shit differently than we have been doing it before. And that's on us, right? So for me, fuck MoMA, yes, absolutely. Now, what are we going to do?
Nit, do you want to share a couple of thoughts?
Yeah, I can get us started. First, I mean, I'm just I'm trying to process myself. It's been kind of crazy to kind of see. I mean, I feel like it's an accumulation of so many years of learning and thought that is just kind of coming out through everyone. So it's also a very emotional moment for me because I feel like, one of the things that I've personally learned about decolonization and abolition is it's a process and it happens in action for me, right? It's not a blueprint or a goal, and we're trying to kind of figure it out all together. So I think, so far, everything that everybody has said, really, I feel like that's just part of this conversation, thinking about land grabs, counterinsurgency, injury and maiming being something that is, now more on, and then you can see that with all these institutions, like look at the board of MoMA. And I think, just one thing I wanted to bring out was also at the Whitney, one of the things that was said was like, oh, it's okay to have Warren Candace because he follows the law, right? He's working with law control, and we as an institution follow the law. So as long as you are within the law, it's fine. And it's the same thing that's happening at MoMA as well, right? Over here, you have like, oh, you were violent and therefore we'll put you out, right? It's a complete shutting down of the door, and like the counterinsurgency kind of state practices we're talking about are right there. And then, that's why I think it's really important to kind of talk about the museums with prisons and universities, and to think about, and I think, you guys have said it before, Fed and Stefano, which is, that we're talking about an abolition of a society that requires prisons, right? So we're talking also about an abolition of a society that requires universities or museums or these institutions to kind of think about pedagogy and its aesthetics. And so some of the questions and thoughts that I have, or also just, thinking about what can we do? One of the things that's been most difficult for us is how the weaponization of identity and people's desire to kind of heal from the colonial past is often used in the kind of project of assimilation into the same system. And that becomes like really difficult. And actually it works as counterinsurgency on its own. Like you don't even need state apparatus to come and say that, oh, this is counter. Like it's literally, it can be done by artists, curators, organizers, people in general, which is to assimilate within the same system that has been killing us. And also at the same time, we have been on strike, for all this time. So just something, I would want to hear more about that, a little bit about like how this weaponization, how can we kind of work towards in our communities around against this weaponization of identity, desire, but also what has been the role of aesthetics to kind of bring us in, and like how much we have had to push back constantly over and over again. Because, this also relates to, just in terms of some of the things that we struggle with is there's also this kind of awkward silence, when things like strike MoMA happen. And we often, and I just want to echo, one last thing I want to say is, strike MoMA, the work has been many people, and I just want to say, you actually said in the beginning, it's not just me and Amin. There's MTL Plus, which is a larger crew. There's Comité Boricua is here, Shalene Rodriguez here, Michael Rakwitz is here. Many of the people who are part of this conversation are here too. So please drop stuff in, the questions if you have anything, because we're kind of thinking about this together. So yeah, I said a lot. I'll just stop there. I mean, if you want to add anything, I just want to hear more about weaponization of identity, our desires to heal, and aesthetics in this project, and how we can kind of, that's it.
I think just one thing I can add, I think in working, working through this idea of the strike is ongoing, let's look at MoMA. I think what we're also trying to do is think about modernity. These larger things around modernity and nation state formation, and thinking about autonomous spaces, and thinking about how can we come together when we're always under assault and attack. That even if we try to stay away from anything, they come after us, which is, Stefano, that's kind of, they seek us out, they come after us. And that even as an individual, if I don't want to fuck with MoMA, they're fucking with other people in which I want to be in solidarity or be, so it's hard to avoid the things that we're entangled with, especially if we're trying to leave, but leaving requires other people to leave too. So one of the ways in which focusing on MoMA is our approach collectively has been very different than the Whitney. In a way, it's kind of inspired by these last words, what can we do and say with responsibility or being responsible around these institutions as a way of pedagogy and learning how power functions, how we're divided and segregated, and how we can communicate with each other, even though we don't have control over social media, and not everyone's on social media, or we don't see each other because it's a pandemic. So then this thing that's called MoMA is a thing that you can kind of ricochet things off of and be in a different kind of conversation around synergies and affect and feeling, where the conversation can happen in its own temporality as we continue to try to test things out. So I think that's another way to think about MoMA. Yesterday, for example, it's not something else. I'm repeating kind of what has been said, but in relation to MoMA. And then yesterday, we were asked, it was just at a different conversation, it's just well, why do you got to fuck with MoMA? Just leave MoMA. Just leave it alone. It's not even relevant. Who cares about MoMA? And the thing is I don't care about MoMA. But MoMA is part of our lives. MoMA harbors people that drop bombs on Gaza. So when you ask me to march in the street, I say I'll march, but tell me something else I can do that's a little bit more fucking meaningful. That's important to me. Now, I don't know what the answer to what more meaningful is, but I know there's closer proximity to the motherfucker that's making money off of dropping bombs on Gaza. And that's just talking about Gaza, not talking about the ammunition, not talking about the maiming, not talking about all of these things. And the third thing is this, we have done this in relation to movements, but we're trying to figure it out. In New York City, there's a dual responsibility of you're part of a collective or a group that's being oppressed and is oppressing. But in addition to that, all the movement kind of conversations they're not strong on anti-imperialism. They don't connect to the reality that you're in New York City, so close to the nerve center of capital, that there's a way by which we can build solidarity across geographies. And that responsibility, what responsibility do we have to the Palestinians, but also what responsibility do we have to the Colombians, to the Chileans, to the whatever? And I'm not talking about nation states, I'm talking about people. And I think that there's something about working through MoMA to not get stuck at MoMA. And I think that that's why we never entered MoMA, right? This is very different than the Whitney. we never entered MoMA. In fact, we found a publicly held, privately owned POPs, they call them, and there's many of them in New York City, where they give you that, where you kind of, in return for building larger, taller buildings, you say you're going to leave your space open for the public. That's that exchange. They're called POPs. That's where we are across the street from that. So, you know, these are some just thoughts to kind of put in the mix, and then go back to you, Sandy, just as a continuing conversation.
Wow, I have so many thoughts about everything. Thanks so much to everybody for, you know, lighting some fires. I don't even know where to begin, other than, you know, Fuck MoMA in some ways resonates more because I think it aligns with the kind of politics of refusal more than strike. Because strike, you're centering something, you know, in a way, because, you know, it's kind of driving a particular action, but it's like thinking beyond, or just like kind of, again, you know, the politics of refusal comes from indigenous theorizing, is, you know, it's so outside, you know, it's just decentering, I guess, in a sense. So I'm thinking about that. I'm thinking, Jasbir, you were so gracious, and like all of your work, but certainly around meaning, pushed my thinking in so many ways, and I think is relevant to this conversation. And that part of me wants to argue for a kind of specificity. At the same time, I'm wondering about what are these connections and conflations. So in other words, there's sort of the kind of violence of, you know, of killing, and then there's the violence of maiming that are distinctive. And I think, Jasbir, you really sort of map that out in terms of, if in no other way than their sort of purpose and function, maybe. And so I'm thinking about, like, as we're sort of talking about universities and museums as precincts, and, you know, do I want a fascist sticking a gun in my face? And how is that different from, like, you know, Dylan, you talked about Darren Walker, our president of our twice named Ford Fellow, myself, you know, who has divided the world into system reformers and system destroyers. And, you know, those are very different kinds of violences. And on one hand, I want to make sure that we keep that distinction. On the other hand, I want, you know, I don't know. We've had this conversation. Like, what's the greatest enemy that we fight? You know, is it the pillars of liberalism, or is it, you know, the fuckers we encounter, you know, enacting violence on our bodies? I don't know. I get confused about it all the time. So I'm thinking about that. I'm thinking about, Stefano, this notion of like these autonomous communities and the kind of general are always already striking, and kind of Fred's notion of being here, there, and everywhere, and the ways in which that makes me think about, you know, as Patrick Wolf talks about Indigenous people, the only thing Indigenous peoples have to do to be in the way of like the colonialist capitalist machine is to stay home. Like, you're not trying, and Jasbir also kind of, I really appreciate kind of the ways in which you brought disability justice organizers into this conversation. And I thought about them when I think about this notion of staying home. And you don't have to go anywhere to you know, they come looking for you. So that sense of like folks coming looking for you, and policing, and not just policing, but sort of, again, and not killing you for trying to stay home, for trying to just not be part of that. They're still killing you. So, you know, I'm not sure where this is all bringing me, but I'm wondering about that tension between kind of the specificity of things and kind of the ways in which we're conflating things, all of which brings me to, you know, in Quechua, there's this notion of kame, which is like, you cannot, it's a sort of a completely different kind of organization of a cosmology and ontology, I think, in Quechua, and the language reflects that. But kame is sort of this overarching principle where where at the same time, you can't have processes of creation that don't always already include processes of destruction, and you hold those things in tension all the time as a way of ordering kind of the world. And so in some ways, I think it helps me to make sense of things. And Natasha, I want to think about kind of, I don't know, I'm so over kind of liberal discourses of identity. I mean, it's its own, I mean, the weaponization is really the right word about desire, about kind of the ways aesthetic is even taken up. You know, I don't even know how to think about desire outside of a sort of a capitalist, extractive, accumulative discourse. But I think obviously a lot about kind of what is the pedagogical project in this? How do we think differently in ways about, I don't know that I even want to call it art. I think here about Emily Johnson's work, an IIAAF choreographer, who's most recently is organizing around the East River. She's a dancer and a choreographer, but like what she choreographs and how she imagines choreography is kind of just how we're moving through space in a broader project of liberation and sovereignty. And how do we bring people together? How do we bring people together in experiences to reconnect, not just to land, but to each other, to kind of think beyond and not just about ourselves, but, you know, other than human kin, in which we're also deeply, you know, our deep relations are also being violently upended on the daily by the same forces. So I think in that sense, I think about maybe our sense of what we even think about art as not being encased or imprisoned in these institutions like MoMA, but are elsewhere, you know, and how our attention to those, it's not that they aren't there, we just aren't being attentive maybe in the right way, or being, you know, don't have access to the kind of teachings that allow us to see what's there. But maybe that's part of the pedagogical project, is to kind of enable folks to even see what they can't see right now. And I think the last thing I'll say that is also a part of all of this is I keep thinking about it can't really be a here and there, like it's not at MoMA or here or whatever, because there aren't just like these satellites of being. It's that some ways of being, as we all been talking about, are enabled by the destruction of other ways of being. And so we have to intervene in there some way, shape, or form. Beyond that, I don't really have any answers. I'm tossing it to you, Dylan.
Yeah, appreciate that. I don't know that I have any answers. I like to try to pretend I do. So let me engage in that pretend play with you all. Knowing I'm probably wrong, but that's okay, because we can work through this together, right? So I want to echo and amplify what Sandy just said about the importance of the pedagogical. And this is something I think I've been saying this for like 15 years now, right? Which is, I think we have been and still remain in a historical moment where the primary modality of abolitionist praxis is probably needs to be pedagogical. And that's to say, that's not a permanent privileging. There are other moments, or I should say not necessarily moments, but there might be other geographies or places in which the primary form that abolitionist praxis takes is not necessarily pedagogical. It might actually be, I don't know, it could be paramilitary. You know what I mean? It could be, in some bizarre world, policy making, right? Who knows? All right. So I'm saying that when we think about the importance of pedagogical practice, that's not necessarily a permanent state of affairs, but I think that is the current state of affairs. So just to say that when we think abolition, we think about what the work entails. The pedagogical realm is absolutely central to it at this particular moment in most geographies. And this is, I think, part of how we can try to address what Natasha raised as the weaponization of identity, right? Which is this kind of, I don't know, neoliberal, neocolonial, you know, appropriation of oppressed, colonized, chattelized, incarcerated people's positions as a way to, you know, repress thought, to repress being, to repress insurgent and liberatory and autonomous formations of community and being. I mean, that's what I take it to mean, right? So I think one way to get at disarticulating the premises through which such identities get weaponized as forms of counterinsurgency and repression is to actually address how the political and cultural identities that circulate in periods of accelerated revolt and movement are subject to that very process of perhaps weaponization, perhaps commodification, okay, perhaps forms of opportunism and grift. Okay, and I started talking about abolition for a reason, which is that we're in that moment with abolition as a political cultural identity right now. We're in a moment where the notion or the kind of the identity abolition is being actively claimed as an activist and academic brand or individual identity. So the most recent thing I've been repeating obsessively is the idea that there's no such thing as an individual abolitionist. You don't get to fucking do that. All right, like that's not how that shit works. Abolition is an insurgent attempt at counter community against identity. That's what it really is, right? And I'm saying identity in the way Natasha was saying it, right? I'm all for identity in like the good ways, but I think there has to be an understanding that this is part of the way I've always. As soon as people brought me into abolitionist community, which is how I think about it, right? Like I think about it as abolitionist community. It's always changing. It's a complex, internal struggle is all part of this. But ever since I've been able to identify myself as being in an abolitionist community, it's about what one of the co-founders of this incredible organization, incredible movement, really called Ujima Medics in Chicago, and I'll put something in the chat. I'll link to the chat in a second. But Amika Tendahi, who's one of the co-founders of it, Ujima Medics. I was talking to her a couple of weeks ago, and she intervened on my thinking around this because she challenged the ways that I and many other people have until now been using the notion of accountability within movements. And even within communities that don't necessarily identify themselves as movement communities, but notions of accountability. She challenged that and she said, you know what, like we don't use that term in Ujima Medics. By the way, Ujima Medics is this incredible grassroots, black feminist, black women-led organization in Southside Chicago that does emergency response to treat gunshot wounds and asthma attacks for Black people in Southside Chicago, because that is what they identified as two of the primary forms of preventable death among Black people. And the state was completely complicit, if not actively encouraging those forms of premature preventable Black death. So they're an abolitionist organization. They draw from like Black feminist, Black womanist healing practices that go centuries back. All right, so that's who Ujima Medics is, just in case you all didn't know. But when Amika started talking about challenging the notion of accountability, the term that she and others use in Ujima Medics is shared responsibility, which is way deeper. Right, like that made my mind explode. All right, and what it meant was that the way she articulated to me, what it meant was that part of this melting away, part of this challenging, part of this, in a sense, a kind of momentary abolition of identity in the way that Natasha talked about it. It means that you are sharing in a responsibility that obligates you to intervene on somebody else's mode of being because you give a shit about them, because you care about them. So concretely what this means, is that, and Natasha, is that I would be in a community of shared responsibility with you, and I would tell you to back off of this or that action because you look like you're sick, right? You seem unwell. So because I care about you and I'm in a position of shared responsibility with you, then I'm gonna say, let me or let so-and-so do that in your place, and you stay home today, right? I'm trying to be as practical as possible, right? But I'm saying we're looking for practical responses. That's part of what this means. Thinking about what I think it was Fred that raised it in the relation to universities, right? We never do that shit in universities. We don't have a sense of shared responsibility with each other in universities in that way, right? If anything, is the opposite. We push each other to work harder by talking about how hard we work. and that's the grind. That's the grind that slowly, sometimes quickly, kills some of us. And I don't say that lightly. I was at UC Berkeley as a grad student, when June Jordan passed, when Barbara Christian passed, when Albert Johnson passed. All these senior Black intellectuals passed within a couple of years of each other, and it was deep. And I was like, I understood it, and I felt it as being the institution that ground away at their being. So that's part of this in trying to challenge how it is that identity gets weaponized. I mean, abolitionist praxis for me is an attempt at counter community against those forms of identity. So there's that piece. I'll also say that another aspect of this that we have to understand is that warfare, this domestic war, is a totality, yes, but it's also marked by asymmetrical casualties. So that's another point at which identity categories necessarily kind of fall apart a little bit, because once you recognize the asymmetrical casualties, for that matter, the asymmetrical targeting that domestic war engages in all the time, and the different spatial geographies, the different temporalities of it, then part of the move toward abolitionist community or liberatory community, whatever it might be, is to try to generate forms of autonomous, relatively autonomous, or insurgent being, maybe alter being, in relation to these same institutions that are waging these wars that create asymmetrical casualties. I say this because institutions like museums and universities, they're skilled, they plan, they're prepared to deal with resistance, right? And way too often, the resistance that they are already skillfully planning and preparing for is premised on these kind of liberal, neoliberal notions of identity. Okay, that's part of the problem. That actually plays into these institutions' counterinsurgency skill sets. I'll give you an example that is both amusing and kind of horrific. You know, speaking of strikes, right? The May 3rd was the first day of Abolition May from cops off campus, and we called for a day of refusal. Again, invoking our colleague and friend Audra Simpson, right? We said everyone just walk. It was basically a strike, right? Everyone walk off. Don't be on email. Don't go to class, etc. So we get engaged in a small in-person action at the campus where I work, University of California, Riverside. And what's interesting is that the vice chancellor in charge of planning and budget, whom the police basically report to, right? So this is somebody who basically works as the chief of police. He came by to check us out, you know, in this friendly, older white guy way. And so I started talking with him, and I jokingly, not jokingly said, you know, Jerry, you know, what I really want to do is I don't think UCRPD should be around, and I want to burn the fucking building down. And here's the funny thing that it's not funny. It's actually kind of weird and horrific. He responds by saying, you know what, go ahead, because we just got a new insurance policy for that place. So in a nutshell, this is what I mean when I say that places like universities, they are skilled, they are planning, and they're prepared to deal with resistance. All right, so another point that I'll make, and then I'll shut up, because I want to hear what all y'all got to say. Maybe another way to start to work through a different relation to a genocidal anti-Black colonial totality is one that does not require the implied and actual circuit of resistance, right? Maybe we need to push back and challenge how we seem to consistently fall back on that idea, which is more than an idea because it actually grounds our practical actions, right? When we think about resistance, it's always a circuit. I think about other examples in which people are they are deeply, complexly in a permanent state of revolt. That's not the same. I don't see that as the same as resistance. You know, I just don't. I think about the multiple generations of carceral revolt by incarcerated people, particularly by incarcerated Black people, that is all about the kind of transgenerational memory and inhabitation of the plantation, of the slave plantation. And you see this in carceral revolts in throughout North America, throughout this hemisphere, throughout the world, in which folks, including non-Black incarcerated people, will cite slavery. They will cite hemispheric, you know, so-called American slavery as the touch point for grounding what they are doing. And the relation they have is not one of resistance, right? It's a complex one. I can't really simplify it into a phrase, but it's some combination of abolitionist creative destruction, of flight, or what Stefano and Fred would call fugitivity, of marronage. I mean, it's all these things, right? For especially for Indigenous and Puerto Rican incarcerated people, it's anti-colonial, not decolonial, now anti-colonial, right? In the destructive sense, you are destroying the colonial apparatus. That's something different than resistance. So there's that piece. I also think about, if I can draw from my own, genealogy, I think about the half millennium of indigenous revolt throughout the Philippine archipelago that's never stopped, right? In which the opposition was now, or like in these times, it's as much to the Philippine nation state as it was to Spanish colonizers, US colonial occupation, attempted Japanese colonial, incursion and whatnot. That's a different relation to the civilizational project than one of resistance. So maybe one working method that can challenge the way we rely on the resistance paradigm all the time is something like a guerrilla paradigm, something like that. I'm not sure. You know what I mean? Like I got to work through that with you all. But I think that maybe something like that could help ground a different relation to these institutions, as well as the ideological work that's part of the constant grind of being forced to inhabit these institutions. I'm feeling what Fred said. You can oppose those institutions, and that shit is like, it's not sustainable because you're in them, and you depend on them in all these fucked up ways, right? So I think a guerrilla relation, I don't know, something like that, you all. I'm struggling. I'm gonna shut up.
Thanks, Dylan. Thank you so much, Jasbir.
Okay, so I have no idea where to start at all. I guess I wanted, this is going to be completely kind of responding to different things that people have said, but I wanted to go to something that Fred said, which is the vast majority of policing happens by faculty, which is really so true. And I was listening to this great conversation a couple of weeks ago between Jennifer Doyle and Nick Mitchell about how our participation in grading and reporting plagiarism and all of the kind of institutional mechanisms, gatekeeping, exam protocol, et cetera, all of these things are the ways in which we are the kind of vast majority of policing. I think this also goes to the weaponization of identity as well, particularly insofar as the identity of the tenured faculty is probably, that identity formation is the most policing identity formation that exists at the university. So, this past couple of weeks, we've all been involved, those of us who are involved in Palestine solidarity activism, we've all been involved in this, process of writing statements, which in other times would be considered, I think, mostly performative. Sign a statement, sign a petition. We've all talked about the futility of these kinds of activities. But in these past weeks, it was really a way in which institutional spaces had to kind of contend with the paucity of their politics and the resistance, the intractable kind of spaces that faculty, tenured faculty, take up. So the problem in terms of standing up for Palestine is not that you're waiting for tenure, because tenured faculty are disciplined into a kind of relationship of alliance and fidelity with the academy, right? So the people who are really standing up against the figure of the tenured faculty member were precarious adjuncts, precarious grad students signing these statements, because this is a profession where job security is something that they no longer look towards this profession, and they no longer look towards the university for job security. So, just one thing is to kind of wrench away this fantasy of academic freedom and the tenure from each other, right? It's giving us absolutely nothing. And in fact, getting tenure means that you're inculcated into an understanding of the kind of hierarchy around political action and speech, and who is going to be allowed to do what and who's going to be punished for doing what. So that's one kind of weaponization of identity. We've seen this too in terms of the Rutgers Union. There's a coalition of 16 unions that represent different labor categories across Rutgers University. That formed in order to develop a work share program, which allowed faculty to furlough and access unemployment in exchange for a freezing of layoffs of adjunct faculty, as well as of other laborers. And the biggest issue there were, again, the tenured faculty not wanting to identify as laborers, right? And not wanting to identify with other kind of stand in solidarity, especially with kind of BIPOC precarious laborers. And to go to kind of what Dylan was talking about, this equity, diversity, inclusion rubric is a way of kind of constantly peeling off faculty from what could be a more sustainable, more worthy project of alliance across different labor categories. This is the Rutgers Union is one of the few kind of positive things that I see happening at the university at this moment. It's committed to looking at how universities are handling their money, and looking at the ways in which universities have made huge amounts of money off of the pandemic, right? So it's not just ruling class, it's not just Jeff Bezos, it's not just that all of these people who have money made money, it's universities who have made an unbelievable amount of money during the pandemic as well. And in fact, have misused stimulus funds and reinvested those funds into the stock market because it's free money that they don't have to pay interest on, and they might not even have to pay back. So these, to me, these are the places of the weaponization of identity that are kind of inescapable for those of us who are still laboring within these institutions, right? I wanted to mention one thing, which is that it's the 6-month anniversary of the start of the farmers' protests, and despite all of the complexities of that congregation, I think that there's a lot to be learned about the ways in which that congregation and that strike has sustained itself over 6 months, which include kind of theological practices of care, and communal, building of communal spaces, the kinds of theological, spiritual practices that aren't normally associated with certain kinds of strike activities or gatherings. So I'm still really interested in what's going to happen, what's happening and going to happen with the farmers' protests, and I don't want to lose sight of that, of the magnitude of the farmers' protests, right? It's still understood as the kind of some of the largest protests we've ever seen, some of the largest mass gatherings we've ever seen, and really something that complicates what we think of as the street, because it really is a process of a kind of constant renewal of assembling that's going on in Punjab, on the outskirts of New Delhi, and a kind of complicated social fabric that's being both deployed and developed as that protest continues, right? Understood as a kind of sustainable revolt in some ways, right? If we move away from resistance, as Dylan's talking to us about. The other thing the last thing I'll say is just, and this is in terms of Palestine, and also Dylan, what you're talking about, that abolition has become a kind of commodifiable identity formation, right? And we see this also with decolonization. We've known this for a while, right? We've heard that the kind of commodification of the notion of decolonization as a kind of pedagogical reform, as a way of addressing syllabi, as a way of diversifying our curriculum, all of these things, they kind of domesticate decolonization within the university. And of course, we keep kind of asking questions like, where else are we learning? Where else do we want to learn? Where else can we move knowledge production outside of these spaces? And decolonization does not happen in the university. It's a pedagogical reform, right? I was listening to Mesnat Keto talk about this in terms of Palestine. And she said, well, it turns out decolonize is a metaphor when it comes to Palestine, because you can see the limits of decolonization when it's tethered primarily to these institutional processes, within the academy, within the settler museum. And despite the kind of swelling of solidarity networks that we're seeing right now, Progressive, except for Palestine, is still well and alive in the academy, and sustained through the kind of tenured faculty identity configuration as well. So I wanted to, I just wanted to kind of highlight that decolonization is a kind of empty promise if it's not understood in relation to anti-colonial, insurgency that's happening, right now in Palestine, that's been happening. And to go to disability justice for a moment, what's happening in disability justice is so interesting because it is, and this goes to, Amin, your point about the difficulty of thinking about anti-imperialist organizing formations, right? The way in which abolition has been taken up by disability justice formations is really through an internationalist, a kind of anti-imperialist internationalist framework, right? So, for example, Sins Invalid, which is one of the most interesting disability justice organizations, they made connections between incarceration in the United States, incarceration in Palestine, as sites where both disproportionate numbers of disabled people are institutionalized, but also mass disablement is being produced during the 2014 war on Gaza. So they already have a kind of internationalist, anti-imperialist abolitionist frame that is committed to decolonization, and it's committed to that decolonization because it understands defund the police, defund the military, defund ICE, defund the occupation, right? It's all a kind of continuum around what's a carceral space, right? What's a carceral infrastructure? And this is why it's so important to think about, Sandy, what you were saying too about, who's not in the streets and why, and what's happening when they're not in the streets. What are they doing? So the pandemic showed this to us too, that so many of us couldn't be out last summer in the streets. I couldn't be out last summer in the streets. And we had to rethink. And these are things, when we talk about, the demands for productivity, the extractive economies in the academy, disability justice folks are teaching us about how to challenge that stuff. They've been teaching us that for a long, long time. And they've also been teaching us about what protest looks like from home or from the car or from a bed that's placed next to a prison, right? Where people are not just at home, in bed at home, but in bed, next to a site of struggle. So I think these are really important ways that we can make connections to work that's already being done, and figure out how we think differently about where protest happens, how we think differently about what an action is, how we think different. And again, some of those issues have been forced already this year during the pandemic, right? When people are trying to figure out how we congregate. We've been trying to figure that out all year. I wanted to read something that Natasha wrote, because I'm assuming we're probably coming to a close, but this is something that Natasha wrote for an issue of October on decolonization that came out last year. So I'm going to read this because I thought it was really incredible. As cultural and educational institutions enact further cuts and attempt to justify a new normal of austerity, they will undoubtedly be sites of intensifying struggle, but these struggles will also be porous with educational, artistic, and organizing activities occurring outside formal institutions, in the streets, and in autonomous movement spaces. Think of decolonial schools for all ages, media labs and garden beds, carpentry classes and community energy systems, art history classes and poetry workshops, film screenings and self-defense trainings, no-cop zones and sanctuary spaces, all disarticulated from the time of the commodity of work and of professional specialization. These are forms of life that are already practiced as a matter of resistance and survival around the world, but physical spaces provide them with localized base camps and hubs of power where the uprisings of the future can germinate and blossom forth in 1,000 ways. Such spaces can embody the shifting of relations and rearrangement of desires required for decolonization, cultivating a politics of life, land, and liberation amongst the ruins of empire.
Thank you, Jasbir. I just want to kind of acknowledge that we may run a little bit over, but Sandy, you have to leave at 2. So if you have any last, sorry, I mean, you have to leave in 5. So if you have any last thoughts before we go to Stefano.
No, and it's just, you know, just really nice to bask in all these words and thoughts. So just want to thank everybody for inviting me into the space, and I'm going to listen for as long as I can. I mean, I'm going to hang in there.
Sounds good. Thanks, Sandy. Stefano.
Thanks. I guess I'll pick up a little bit with what where Fred ended, talking about how we might think about going back into the classroom if we're teachers and we have that opportunity in certain spaces in the world right now. But the way I wanted to think about that was to say, is just to remind ourselves why they keep pieces of art in museums. Now, of course, one reason they do it is that they're securitizing it. They're keeping it safe from the people who would have it back. Another reason is that they're renting it. Every time you pay to go to the museum, essentially, you're just renting that artwork while you walk through. And of course, they're, as you know, the most obvious example always is they're keeping it because they want to commoditize it and speculate on it. But there's another reason, and it's really the main reason that they keep art in museums, and that's so they can pretend there's such a thing as a work of art. That is, that there is some individualized thing that you can go and see, and that this thing is a work of art. And that's something that, you know, needs to be subjected to a thorough anti-colonial attack, that there is such a thing as a work of art. Why would we want to do that? Well, in the first instance, if we can dispose of the idea that there is such a thing as a work of art, we have the added benefit of disposing of such a person as the artist. And the benefit of that, of course, is that, coming back to what Dylan was saying, we're starting to move away from any kind of notion that it could be anything like an individual abolitionist. Because another way to think of these universities and the schools and the museums is as these vast shredding machines. You feed communities into them, you feed collectivities into them, you feed the indistinct into them, and it comes out individuated. And that's what the museum does. It's a shredding machine of social aesthetics into things like works of art and artists. Now, I don't work in a museum, but I do work in a university when they'll have me. And in a university, we would have to think about what the parallel to that would be. Well, certainly the idea that there's such a thing as an exam, the idea that there's such a thing as an assignment, the idea that there's such a thing as a piece of scholarship. You know, there's a reason these are also trapped in the university, is because otherwise they would just simply escape into their collective origins. So they're kept in there as individuating tools. And as long as they're there, then we're not allowed to say the thing we need to say most of all, which is there's no such thing as a student. And that's where I think some practical possibilities lie, in addition to all the great ones that have been laid out by Jasbir and Dylan and Sandy so far. And I feel like this is where Fred wanted to go, in a sense. You know, we can take some practical steps. And as usual, the truly revolutionary practical steps are characterized by being revolutionary. Dispensing with the notion of a work of art, dispensing with the notion of a student, dispensing with the notion that you produced a piece of scholarship or a book that won a prize or any of those things. is a step towards fighting the individuation that shredding machine is constantly producing. And we all have practical ways of working on that right now. Those practical ways are absolutely revolutionary and will be met with the sternest of violence. Try getting rid of your assignments. Try giving everybody an A. Seems like an innocent practice, but it will be met with the most severe consequences, which is why maybe we should do it. Maybe there's something in attacking these shredding machines, so long as we are to some extent attached to them. On the other hand, what we really want is to create the conditions for collective flight. There's no point in going by yourself. There's no point in going by yourself. We have to create the conditions for collective flight. And the only way to do that is to restore the collectivity that these shredding machines are constantly destroying. So where we are in our disadvantages, in everything but economic condition, we have some practical work that we can do if we're going back into our institutions in a few months. Thank you, everybody, for all the great conversation so far.
Thanks, Stefano. Fred.
Yeah, it's been a great time, and I know everybody's getting tired now, so I'm gonna try my best not to go on too long, just to pick up with, really echoing everybody in the sense that yeah, we should be giving A's out like judges give time, and I do, I guess, want to, there's a comment, in the chat from Connor Tomas Reed, saying that nobody's talking about how to take over and collectively reshape these institutions. And I'm like, yeah, I know I'm not doing that. And because I don't want to take over the institution. I think I'm a descendant of slaves who didn't want to take over the plantation. They just wanted to burn the motherfucker down. And part of it is because you could say, oh, well, but there could have been a collective takeover of the plantation and turn it into a agricultural workers collective. But I think maybe my folks understood that the plantation wasn't just about who owned it, that it was an apparatus of social and ecological disaster, right? In addition to the violence that was done to people on the plantation was a violence that was done to the earth, okay? And the university, similarly, is not about who owns knowledge or who owns knowledge production or who owns the resources for thought. The university was always designed to regulate knowledge, always, right? To regulate it and to incarcerate it. Now, the history that we live in is a history that pushes us into the unenviable position that for some of us who love certain kinds of knowledge, the university ends up being the only place we can go to get it because the motherfuckers hoard it there. I like to read certain kinds of books, and so I had to go to the university. Okay. And maybe my parents had certain kinds of dreams of my upward mobility. And so that's part of the reason that they sent me there. But they also sent me there with like a whole range of ideas and a whole range of moral and ethical and social and aesthetic commitments that were absolutely antithetical to that place. Which is to say, they sent me there not only within the context of a contradiction, but it seems to me that they sent me to the university to constantly be deepening and at the same time also heightening that contradiction. And I know Stefano and I love to say both, every time we say deepen the contradiction, we also love to say heighten the contradiction, because that fucked up disorientation, that fucked up spatial disorientation with regard to contradiction was one that our mentor Cedric Robinson loved to activate all the time. He never saw a contradiction that he didn't want to both heighten and deepen, and it means that, there's a certain notion of purity, you know, that they were constantly trying to disrupt, constantly trying to pee on, to be perfectly honest. And you know, I mean, I guess the last thing I'll say is that, you know, a confession. You know, my partner Laura Harris is laughing at me for the last 3 weeks because I got on this binge that I get on every once in a while where I have to watch all the reruns of The West Wing. I'm fascinated by that shit. I'm fascinated by how virulent neoliberalism deludes itself into thinking of itself as benevolent. I'm interested in that shit. Like, I'm interested in the ways that they seem so clear about that shit. It's funny to me, but it's no more funny to me than artists thinking that art must be good because they do it. Right? It's no more fucked up than that. And you got to understand, I'm not saying that shit from the position of somebody who hates art. I'm saying that shit from the position of somebody who loves art and who I'm pretty convinced that I can't live without it. Right? Is this an impurity that requires me to flagellate myself? Or is it a contradiction that I must join with my friends to heighten and deepen? I think it's the latter, you know? And, you know, I guess the last story I'll tell is when I came to NYU, some friends who I had known here before, they asked me to be a part of the AAUP executive committee. And I was totally ambivalent about the shit because, to be perfectly honest, when I saw the letters AAUP, I thought of Carrie Nelson, okay? And I just never wanted to be a member of any club that fascist, you know, was a member of, okay? So basically, but it was my friends who asked me, and when my friends ask me to do something with them or go somewhere with them, I feel like I'm supposed to go. And my friends on the AAUP, I'm constantly feeling like I'm always on the verge of offending them, you know, because they always want to, I mean, I hate to put it like, not because I don't go to the meetings and talk a lot of shit. I just don't say that much, you know, because me and Stefano invariably just wrote some shit that goes against the grain of everything that they're saying, you know, and it's just like, you know, university governance, fuck university governance. I don't want to engage in no faculty governance. I don't want to govern a fucking thing. You know, I don't want to do that, you know, and I'm, you know, I don't transparency. I don't know if I'm for transparency. I come from people who get looked at and looked through all the damn time. I don't know about all that. You know, I got to think about that. But the thing is, what's going to be my ethical comportment towards my friends who are at that place in the way that they think about things? Do y'all, I want to say, do y'all see what I'm saying? But I can't see nobody. But what you know, I'm just like, I think I probably, you know, strenuously disagree with Connor Thomas Reed about certain shit. But, you know, on the other hand, man, you know, I'm with you, you know, I'm with you. I don't want to be fighting you. And what I guess I'm concerned with is that this constant comportment of ourselves against our enemies almost invariably produces a set of conditions in which we turn out to project all of the brutality that we can't visit upon them upon one another. And we need to work through that. You know, we need to have some structures and some places, some places of refuge where we can work through that. You know, I'm running, but I'm not running away from anything any more than I'm running towards something too. You know, and I want to be running with my friends, you know, and I'm going to work and try to be in some kind of convivial solidarity with my friends, you know. And obviously today was like a, you know, for me at least, a beautiful example of that. So so I'm glad to be hanging and running with y'all. So thank you. And everybody out there.
Yeah, thank you, Fred, and thanks everyone. I'll just say a few words to close us out and then pass it on to Nit for a few words. But I mean, this is an example of Strike MoMA, the thing that we talked about that people worked on for 3 months. And it's thanks to everyone on this call and beyond in terms of the work and the engagement that you've been doing. And I think that if people read it online, there's links to stuff. But just to give you an example, it's just, heighten the contradictions, that's something that we talked about with Fred. I mean, everyone's, print is on this, and we've tried to kind of think through some of these challenges so we can have a different set of conversations. Because we're tired of these old conversations that are just about this or that. And then we have to convince everyone in order to move. And one of the interesting things about MoMA, and it's around, again, this idea of identity, and sometimes it's, coppish mentality, and it's very harmful because it seems like people are uncomfortable when someone does something that's a little bit unsettling. And they feel like in order for their identity to stay intact, they need to attack the thing that's being done when people are not doing anything else. and there's this hard tension between trying to say, look, there's a diversity of tactics. We can move separately and together. There's ways in which we can figure shit out together. But we refuse MoMA setting the terms, and we refuse meeting on the terms of MoMA. And in this sense, MoMA is just a metaphor. It doesn't fucking matter. All these people, and Fred, in conversations, Stefano, I think we talked about this. And it's related to what Dylan said and what Jasbir and Sandy are bringing up. In fact, the first statement we put out when we found out about Liam Black is because people asked us to say something about it. And we said less than 500 words. And the title was Fuck MoMA. But somehow that became an issue. Somehow that became an issue of you don't care. And there's respectability politics of like, you're shitting on other people's dreams, right? And I think like these things get conflated in such a way. And, I never want to make someone else feel bad. That's not why I do any of this. And no one's paying me to do it, and we're failing in the process as we learn and we try to figure it out. And I think that something about MoMA is just like, it's touching people in a way that even to me is kind of surprising, because you want to have certain set of arguments and conversations that are necessary in order to figure shit out. But it's just like, why does it have to begin with MoMA must exist? And then we start having the conversation. And I think like that's something that it's confusing to me, but we're here for it. And then the final point I'll make in terms of the logic of counterinsurgency that the MoMA regime has deployed. So what Dylan has mentioned is that they knew my name, they knew my religion, they brought people out that spoke my language, right? It was speaking to me in Arabic. And when I asked the person, hey, oh, you're Arab? He's like, no, but like in this sense, I'm like, oh, well, I'm Palestinian. He's like, I'm definitely not Palestinian, right? So there's these kind of knowledge, there's this kind of shit that's being weaponized against you, but then there's these emails internally that are going to staff and to workers saying, we are violent. We don't care about their livelihood. We want to destroy the museum. We don't care about the art. And if people had read this, they would know that we actually care deeply about people's positionalities, and we understand what the colonial condition puts us and pits us against. And there's no way in this that we feel like other people should withdraw or should boycott. We didn't say any of that. We said that people can act in the ways that make sense. But one thing is certain, the walls of the museum need to become more and more porous, right? And that's the important part. So when we have a space outside of MoMA, it's kind of welcoming to everyone that's inside of MoMA to join us. And there has been some people that joined us. But I think the issue around class in the art world or art system isn't discussed enough. People are happy to have the role of the fucking artist as an identity, but they refuse to acknowledge their class position in relation to it. Then you have people structurally top of the museum, or like what they call the back end of the museum. And these are people that are maybe well educated, that have MFAs, and then the front end are just like racialized bodies, black, brown, whatever. And there's a class dimension. So now all of a sudden the solidarity of the white people up top, right? It's just like, why are you making the guards' lives more difficult? What are you supposed to do with that? And then this becomes the point of contention. So I bring this up to just kind of say that, like, these are some of the ways in which we're also learning about counterinsurgency and soft power. And, you know, I'm grateful for these thoughts, and we shared the questions for people to think about in groups and circles. And this is just a starting point of these kind of set of questions. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone, because I feel like we just started the conversation. So I hope we can have another one, because I want to begin from also, like, how do we uphold the strike and not break it? Because I think this question of upward mobility, in, you know, artists as identity, all of these things, I think we need to continue to break that kind of logic of living, because, you know, I'm thinking also, like, you know, we haven't talked about enough about abolition of private property as a thing, right? Like knowledge as private property, land as private property, art as private property, which Stefano, you mentioned. But I mean, it's so much of it is about how we relate to the world around us and things. And we just started to begin to talk about it. And I think for me personally, a lot of ways I've learned myself is just being engaged in struggle. And I think I just want to echo back what Dylan said, that, you know, that abolition and decolonization does not happen outside of the community. It's not an individual project. And I think what we're seeing is, like, you know, even with counterinsurgency and everything, so much of it is around taking it back to the individual and removing any kind of collective space to even kind of flourish or sustain itself. And so for that, I also wanted to thank Jasbir to bring in the farmers, you know, specifically from Punjab, because it's like literally the way, I mean, there's a lot of, you know, there's a lot of inherent problems in our imagined communities, you know, whatever, you know, if you're talking about that. But at least what we see is that we can care and we can take care of each other as we are also refusing and exiting. And I think that's the exit is really, you know, and Fred, something that you always mention is, what is the relationship of this abolition and exodus? And I think that's where I want to begin. Hopefully next time when we kind of come together, we can talk more about that. I think this conversation was important to kind of lay the groundwork of even getting there and thinking there and getting there and taking our friends with us, because I don't want to do it with just a bunch of people. I think what happened to us, you know, around working with movements, you know, for the last 10 years, especially after the George Floyd moment and the counterinsurgency that kind of happened everywhere, we realized is how many of us, just a few of us, are standing together. And like a lot of times, you know, the relations that we had built were actually not at all what we thought they were, you know. And so the kind of problems of, you know, patriarchy and sexual harassment, or like, you know, all of these different, you know, NGOs, class mobility and upward mobility into institutions, museums, you know, ownership as an idea, ownership of parts, and, you know, like even who, you know, calls themselves as abolitionists or decolonial, you know, knowledges, all of these things. There's so much that we have to undo and unlearn and practice together and rehearse together and kind of learn to assemble together, that I feel like this is a very generative conversation for that. And hopefully, yeah, I just want another one. That's it. I'm going to stop talking. I think we should have another conversation where we can actually begin from the point of like how to keep upholding the general strike.
Yeah. Thank you all so much, and appreciate everyone tuning in, and free Palestine and free all the places that we care about and come from.
Oh, I forgot to mention one thing. I'm just going to drop the link in the chat. Oh, I was just saying tomorrow, it's week 8 of the deoccupation at MoMA. We're going to be talking about free Mumia. There's going to be teaching about Mumia and Move, and also solidarity with Colombia and Palestine and Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico, just in connection to what's happening at MoMA. And then simultaneously, we also hold a virtual space, which is, you know, it's usually got me, Mike Rakowitz, Nelson Molondano Torres, so you can come hang out with us. And also just go into the Strike MoMA website. There's many resources there that can kind of, as we think together about exiting this shit. So how do we come together? Yeah.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.